Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about life through the prism of food. And this week we're with multi-award-winning travel writer and journalist Caroline Eden.
You sort of lure them in with the food, then you can start telling them a little bit about modern history, how the city works, every other aspect of, say, Tajik life.
Her cold kitchen is where we find her comfort cooking recipes that she remembers from her travels on the Trans Siberian Railway, through the dark back streets of a winter in Istanbul, in the midst of political chaos of a coup in Kyrgyzstan. It's about the complexity of life through the prism of food that I found so compelling when I first interviewed her about her second book, Black Sea, and which inspired this podcast. I asked her why, after travelling so extensively for her last 3 books, it's her kitchen in Edinburgh where we find her dreaming up the past and cooking up her memories.
The idea with this book was because my other 3 books, so Samarkand was the first one, then I did Black Sea, and then I did Red Sands, which came out during the depths of lockdown. It was a very difficult book because it came out in 2020 and I didn't do a single event for it. It was very sad. But it was something I put a lot of work into. It was a book about Central Asia. So those books were all quite far-flung and in faraway lands, and me sort of reporting back. And the idea with this book was to kind of bring it back home and to show people another side of the work that I do. So, have some of Edinburgh coming into the book, which is where I've lived for nearly a decade now. And I have it's a small flat, but it's on 2 floors. So I've got a basement kitchen. The kitchen's the whole ground floor, which isn't a huge space, but the kitchen's downstairs, and then I have a bedroom, sitting room, bathroom upstairs. And when I'm in the basement, it's a very closed-in subterranean world. But you get these wonderful snippets of Edinburgh life coming through, because I'm right in the city centre. Edinburgh life coming through the one window, which is down there. So it's a sash window, and if I have it open in the summer, I can hear sounds of the festival, or wheelie suitcases, or people yelling drunk coming back from a festival event or whatever, or dogs barking, or, bird song. And so Edinburgh comes in. So there's that. And then there's also the journeying that I do in the kitchen when I'm cooking or writing, which is recreating these places either on my laptop or on paper, or in a mixing bowl or in the oven. So it's this kind of idea of travelling in and travelling out and being in this closed subterranean world, but then also going out into the world from that space.
And it feels very much like that. It feels like you're standing there cooking and dreaming, and in some kind of filmic way we kind of float off back to wherever you're writing about, and you take us with you, and it's very real. We go on the Trans Siberian Express. Yes! We get drunk with strangers on a train. We're drinking vodka, and you can smell the dictionary that's smeared with pig fat. And, we're very much with you. When you describe getting drunker and drunker, I actually felt drunker and drunker. It's such a wonderful sort of vicarious experience, isn't it? One of the quotes, one of the things that you write is you say, "My hope is by returning to Central Asia, by recalling a time of such potent stimulation, and by cooking what I ate there, I will ease my woes a little." Again and again, however beautiful the journey that you take us on is, it comes back to a sad place. Were you aware of being sad? Were you sad?
I think there's definitely a melancholy to some of the chapters in the book, and I think that's just because it's realistic. I mean, we're not happy and jolly all of the time. And I think with the Russia chapter in particular, it's interesting that you mentioned being sad around that chapter, because some of them are quite uplifting, I hope. Like finding a cloudberry, for example, up in the Scottish Highlands. That's a very cheerful chapter. But the Russia chapter, obviously it's laced with sadness because of what Russia's become. So when I talk about that Trans-Siberian trip I did, I think it was in 2016. Obviously, that was 2 years after Russia took Crimea. But then, I look back to that trip and I'm not sure if I'm ever going to go back to Russia. My husband used to live there. I mean, we used to visit Russia occasionally. And to be honest, I used to love going there. I found it absolutely fascinating. But now it's upsetting to think about what Russia's become. And I talk at one point about how when we were on a train between Kazan and Yekaterinburg, this man asks us in the dining carriage, what do you both want from Russia? And we were both like, that's a strange question. And my answer now would be to any Russian who asked me that would be to stop stealing Ukrainian land and murdering Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And at the end of the book, we end in Lviv, and I was there just a couple of months before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, which is when the invasion happened. I was there in the November. And of course it's a sad chapter because, of what's happened in Ukraine. So I think it's an honest book, and I think my work is sort of specifically geographically from Eastern Europe to Central Asia, and these are countries, like anywhere in the world, I guess, but still struggling with, the threat of invasion and the post-Soviet hangover and nation building and all of that. And I think, Istanbul, again, is another chapter. I love it because it's quite a melancholy place. You sit on a boat on the Bosphorus and you see the fog and the minarets, and it is quite stirring, but it's also got a sadness to it. But I'm not scared of sadness. I think it's just what life is.
Well, it's very beautiful. I mean, you mentioned Istanbul, and I've pulled out another section. I just love the way you write. You talk about the film noir quality of a winter in Istanbul, and you write rain-lashed post-war apartment blocks, poorly lit alleys, gloom circling around minarets, nocturnal cigarette smokers huddling in doorways, white mist dawns and pea super afternoons. And I've never been to Turkey. I've never been to Istanbul. And I've given up flying now because of my massive carbon footprint during the delicious days. I hope to fly again when they change the fuel. For now, I've travelled through Central Asia and through Turkey with you, and the Trans Siberian is out of another time. It feels like that's not possible anymore. I wonder, those cultural shifts that are your bread and butter, you kind of need them. You need to fill your books with these ghosts and these awful stories in many ways. I wonder how that makes you feel about the future of travelling through Central Asia. Where could you go now that gives you a different perspective?
It's really difficult with travel writing and the sort of writing that I do. I think my thing has always been to concentrate pretty much fully on a particular geographical region. So I'm probably never going to write about, say, Spain, Australia or Peru. I write about certain countries, and it's interesting what you say about your carbon footprint, because it is something I'm very, very aware of with the climate emergency, and I'm certainly on board with it. And I climate denial is a terrible thing. I would say that when I travel, I tend to fly into one place and I travel overland a lot and I go for long periods of time. But obviously I do have a carbon footprint. I think as far as getting fresh material, I think there's a real value to going back to places and seeing things from different angles and repeatedly visiting rather than spreading yourself too thinly. And I think there's always another angle and always another human story to investigate, or, parts of history that perhaps haven't been looked at. So when I write about food, I normally have a reportage aspect. So I'll speak to people on the ground, whether it's a baker or someone I'm having lunch with, or perhaps, in my updated Black Sea edition, I talked to a ship spotter about the stolen Russian grain, which is coming through the Bosphorus. It can be anything, and that's what I love about food. It's such a broad subject, and you can write about anything with it. And, maybe I'll write about a piece of art which has got, depicting a Chaikana or a still life of melons. And I think there's endless possibilities. And I think for me, it's not so much perhaps travelling to different lands, but seeing new places with fresh eyes each time I go somewhere. Yeah,
and this is a lovely way of doing it, just to be in your kitchen and almost look out of the window and remember. Just keep going back to that Trans Siberian kind of thing, because it was just so vivid. But those wonderful sort of Russian forests are juxtaposed with, Storm Arwen you're writing about, and the damage of the Scottish Highlands and the change in the climate as we've just been talking about. It's very, very real. The kitchen as a solitary space for dreaming about the past, and then you cook it real through the memories of the food. It's interesting what you say about the kitchen itself. You say it's a portal to 100 different places, people, time and experiences. We jump back in a time to a different place. And we find you punching down a risen dough, and it's almost like a meditation, a pondering, a looking out of the window and dreaming. How aware are you of the place of the kitchen for telling stories?
It's funny. You have to be very careful when we talk about ideas around homelessness and what home is and having a safe place to live in. I mean, obviously, I'm very fortunate in many ways, but I'd had a very precarious living situation for a very long time, where I'd rented in London and was never quite sure when the letter was going to come through the letterbox about, you've 2 months to pack up because so-and-so is selling. And that kept happening to me. And I was a bookseller when I was in London, so I was on minimum wage and I was topping it up with some other freelance work, but it was really hard existing. And I moved up to Edinburgh eventually, and I managed with my husband to buy this small flat. And it was a total revelation to me, because I finally had somewhere to unpack all my stuff properly and to have a kitchen. And I knew that the kitchen was going to offer me what I needed, which was this sort of like safe space to come back to, because I'm sometimes in quite difficult places. And it's really nice to come back and unload my spices or fabrics or whatever I've picked up and start cooking the recipes. And I knew it was going to be an important place for me. It was the first flat we saw. We saw 10, and this was the first one. And you go downstairs into this kitchen, and I just kept thinking about it after we'd seen all the other flats. And I just thought, that is where life will happen. And that's where these arrivals and departures will happen. And I knew I really wanted to have it. And I worry now I'm never going to leave it, because this flat, it's not perfect in many ways, but now I've written this book about it and I've thought about it in such an intense way, much more I think than most people think about their kitchens perhaps. I worry that I'll never leave.
And there's Darwin, who's sitting, quietly waiting for a little treat. And, the kitchen and the home and the dog, it's a very important grounding space for you. But then we just ping off again into another dream, another memory. And we'll do that with your food moments as well. We go travelling around this sort of area and meet the food in such detail, and then we get a recipe from it. Why, of all of them, have you chosen this one to start? Is this the springtime soup with bulgur tomatoes and herbs?
So we're starting this one because it's a very sort of lovely spring recipe. It's a light soup with bulgur, wheat and tomatoes and herbs. And it's all about how in the Caucasus, in Armenia, Georgia and Azerbaijan, herbs are never an afterthought. They're kind of an entire meal. So I remember being so surprised when I first started to go to the Caucasus that you would be, you'd go for lunch and you'd maybe order some grilled meats and fish and there'll be some bread. But then this entire plate would come of dill, coriander, parsley, purple basil, often with, muddy roots still, like so fresh, straight out the ground, amazing, like massive plate, more than you would buy in a packet in a supermarket. And it's just an incredible thing to see. Like, that's such a different way of eating. So it's about that. And I'm cooking this soup and I'm reminiscing about the herbs in the Caucasus, but really the chapter is about someone who I really love, Carla Grisman, who died back in 2011, but I know I would have loved Carla if I'd ever have met her, and sadly I didn't. But she was a journalist. She worked for the Jerusalem Post for some time, and then she ended up in the 1960s living in this very remote Anatolian village in Turkey called Uzakköy. And she lived with a family for about a year, and she recounts the seasons and the food and the eating traditions and sitting with women in this village over this period of time. And the book is called Dinner of Herbs, Village Life in Turkey in the 1960s. And it's freely available. Eland publish a lovely edition of it. And she just writes so beautifully about food. And I talk about always having her book. I mean, not always, but I often have her book on the kitchen counter when I'm cooking, because it's the sort of writing where you can just open any page at random, read a couple of paragraphs, and it's like poetry. You don't need to read the whole thing. It's like snippets of absolutely beautiful, elevated, transporting writing. And I just love her so much. And I thought Carla would like that soup as well. So yeah, that's what that chapter is all about.
I remember talking to Tamar Adler, who does the same with MFK Fisher. And, you can smell MFK Fisher in Tamar Adler's writing. But it is that sort of taking the spirit of someone else's writing and sniffing it up and putting it into whatever you're doing, whether that's cooking or writing. You talk a lot about the spirit of the travel writer. And in your second food moment, we meet Lady Agnes Jekyll, Eric Newby, and this wonderful woman. Now, how on earth do you pronounce her name? Claire Norstines, is it?
Yeah, I imagine that she's German, so I think it's something like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, she sounds amazing. She was a proper traveller, wasn't she? But she took her evening gowns with her and 128 hard-boiled eggs. How does anybody ever know that? And a bottle of vodka. I love her. Tell me about her.
I reviewed a book called Expeditions Unpacked a few years ago, and it gave me the idea for this chapter, and it's all about what travellers and great explorers took on their trips. And she drove a car around the world, so she had plenty of space for taking what she fancied and picking up things along the way. I can't remember if it was her that also travelled with a set of sand ladders, which I had to look up.
Oh, she did. Yeah, she put them down in the desert.
Yeah, so if you're stuck on sandy terrain, you put these ladders down and you can get your wheels onto it and drive on that way. So she was amazing. And
why would she need her evening gowns from Baghdad to Baikal then? I just want to know what she got up to.
She was obviously very well connected, so I guess if she was going to meet the ambassador or going to some, fabulous party at an embassy, she had the right frock to wear. She was amazing, and that's in the chapter Journey Food.
Yes. Tell us first of all about Lady Agnes Jekyll and her Gruyere sandwiches,
right,
and then head into the hillside pasties.
So we're going back in time a bit with Lady Agnes Jekyll. She was the first food columnist for the Times of London. And I think she goes into some detail about what she would take, on a journey, and she just mentions basically it's sandwiches. I mean, it's not terribly exciting, but it's kind of very British. And she talks about Gruyere sandwiches in particular. Everything has to be very thinly sliced, and she goes into quite a lot of detail about how to make the perfect sandwich.
But you take Rosie Burkett's pasties.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you have travelled literally all over the world. This is your favourite thing to take on your own journeys. Tell me why.
Well, obviously, they have a life, they're not going to last forever. But the thing with the hillside pasties, and I've written to Rosie, and she gave me permission to mess about with her recipe slightly for this book. So I'm making these pasties as I go through this chapter, Journey Food. And it's because I've made this particular recipe more than any other recipe ever. I mean, I make them probably a couple of times a month if I'm at home, and we mainly take them up to the Highlands when we're walking, because the beauty of a pasty is the ingredients, the filling won't fall out like it does of a sandwich, and you can kind of eat them standing up, because if it's raining you don't want to stop, and you can eat them on the move. They're great. I take them on planes if I'm going to the airport, so I don't want to spend £10 on a Pret sandwich. I might take them on the train down to London. But really, to be honest, what I travel with is two things always. Packet of Fisherman's Friends lozenges, which are increasingly hard to find. Normally, nowadays, you have to find them in chemists rather than supermarkets. Packet of those, and a packet of Nairn's cheese oatcakes, which come in not very carbon friendly, because they come in individually packed plastic wrappers for like 5 or 6. And I'll take those, and if I'm desperate on a car journey, like through Central Asia, and you might not come to a tea stop for 4 hours, those will sustain me. I find you can have a couple of those and it staves off hunger for several hours. So those are my favourite journey foods, definitely. But I love Rose's pasties so much. They are, I actually don't eat a lot of meat at all, and they're vegetarian. So you put chard, kale, za'atar egg wash on the outside, which is especially nice. And they're great. Yeah. I love them.
In your third food moment, it is those hillsides of Scotland, the Cairngorms, where we really meet you and James. I mean, we meet James a lot in the Trans Siberian Express as well, but getting drunk on vodka with the strangers. But it is just that you three, you, James and Darwin, your lovely dog, who we really get to know in the chapter Carried Away by a Cloudberry. And you've chosen the blueberry or bilberry jam at the end of this chapter as your food moment. But actually, it is the wonderful sort of descriptions of being at home and being with your family that is so beautiful in this chapter. Is that why you chose this one?
I mean, I think there's something very grounding about making jam. So I'm making this blueberry or bilberry jam because basically I find a obviously wild cloudberry out in the Highlands on its own, and it's like an absolute revelation to me because I'd always wanted to try them in the wild and I'd never found one before, and they're quite rare in Britain. They're really rare, and a bird had obviously dropped the seed and it had grown and I ate it, and it was an amazing experience. And then I go to I can't remember now if it's a Corbett or a Munro, but a big hill named after cloudberries in Gaelic. It's called something like Cloudberry Hill, and looking for cloudberries again, and of course I've never found them, but I did come down off that hill into massive patches of bilberry bushes and I collect them and then I go home and make the jam. But yeah, there's this lovely scene where it's often that I'm sort of trailing behind on these great massive mountain walks that James and I go on, and he and Darwin were up ahead, and I just see this like daub of colour in the kind of purple mossy heather, and I knew immediately what it was, but I couldn't believe it that I'd found this cloudberry, and I called them back, and I kind of have this big quandary about whether to eat it or not.
Yeah.
Because it felt wrong almost, like it was a kind of a miracle to find it. And I was like, should I eat it? But of course I had to. So I did. And a drop goes down my finger and I let Darwin lick the drop of cloudberry. So he also, not that he would have appreciated, but he also had some. So yeah, I think it's all about how every walk is a discovery. But that one was a kind of really miraculous walk.
Exactly. And Darwin is your familiar. He is your best friend. He is very much with you as you cook in a very solitary way in the kitchen. You describe your kitchen as interior, ill-lit, zoomed in and thoughtful, and Darwin is right there with you. And I feel that it describes the book very much. And perhaps that is because we later find out that Darwin doesn't make it.
I just think it's a funny thing with writing, like life writing or memoir, because obviously life is happening as you're writing it. So it had started off to be a book about my kitchen and coming home and sort of travelling within the kitchen, and the kitchen as a portal out to other places and other lands and other people. And that was obviously how the book was progressing. And then it's in seasons, isn't it? So we start in the winter and we end in autumn. And as I was writing the final 3 chapters of the autumn section, Darwin, my beloved beagle, who was highly epileptic and 8.5, unfortunately slipped into a series of terrible fits and we had to put him down. And it's one of the hardest things I've ever been through, because I am an enormous animal lover generally, but I was hugely attached to him. I mean, I say he was the love of my life, and people either get that or they don't, but like I loved him so much. And the grief was awful, and I had to finish the book in those last 3 or 4 months. That's happened in September. I was handing the book in January, and it changed it. And I thought, I can't, because he was a part of the book. He's there with me in the kitchen. He was a reason I like to come home, having him there in the kitchen at my feet when I'm cooking or when I'm writing. I had to write what happened because it would be strange not to. But obviously it hadn't been part of my idea when I started writing the book. And of course, the lovely thing is while it's like incredibly sad and horrible and upsetting what happened and the way it ended, because I'd always dreaded it ending like that, he's on the cover of the book. And I just think that's such an amazing thing, that he will be going into all these bookshops in Britain and around the world, and into people's homes and kitchens to be remembered, because he was such an amazing dog. He was on a lot of drugs, but he was a beagle. He was hugely rambunctious. We always used to joke and say we didn't let it define him, because it didn't. The fits were sort of once every 6 weeks, once every 2 months. And the rest of the time he was like any other dog, but it must have been hard on him taking those drugs. So, yeah, that is a big part of the book.
I know. You say travel gives you a sense of empathy. I think it's absolutely essential. My kids are 25 and 28, and I'm shooing them out the door, even though I don't want to fly myself. I've been plenty of places in the world, and I absolutely think it's so important to have that sense of empathy that travel can give you. When you are faced with a very dangerous situation, as in your fourth food moment, does that kind of make you think, maybe I might just stay at home in my nice ill-lit kitchen and do some hillside walking instead?
No, it doesn't ever make me feel like that, because I am always happiest if my bags are packed by the front door and I'm heading out somewhere. Like airports and train stations are my happy places, definitely. I like to be on the move. But I do sometimes think, how many of the 9 lives have I used up? But it's not usually the really dramatic moments which worry me. It's the road travel. So in the sort of regions that I travel in, the driving is pretty appalling and the roads are very dangerous. So that's always my primary concern.
Yes, but take us to the time of a brutal coup.
Okay, so in 2020, I was heading out to Kyrgyzstan, to Bishkek, which is somewhere I sometimes spend time in. It's a small capital city there, to reignite my Russian lessons with my teacher Jarkin. And I wasn't sure about going at that time of year because we were still in the pandemic period, and there were some doubts around this, but it was a kind of time when I wanted to get back to reporting, and I flew out and everything was fine, and we had one-on-one lessons in the apartment, and then suddenly there was this attempted, we're never quite sure what to call it. I mean, it was a coup. We initially thought it was perhaps going to be a revolution, but basically the president fled, no one was in power, it all unfolds over one night, and it was incredibly violent. And Kyrgyzstan has seen several revolutions, and in previous ones, the death toll had been really high, and I was there on my own right in the city centre, and I wasn't quite sure with what I could see and what I could hear, and I was doing reports to the BBC as this was happening, because I was one of the few, I think I was maybe the only foreign journalist in Bishkek because of the pandemic, and a couple of other journalists I know were in other cities but not in the capital as this happened. So I do sometimes do reporting for the BBC, and they got me on live, and I had to really make sure I knew my Kyrgyz politics quite quickly and clearly to report back about this. But that's not just what the chapter is about food-wise. It's about the fact that I make some unlikely friendships. So Jarkin, my teacher, is a lovely woman, and she takes me out to a nearby village where some of her relatives live, and I get invited to this because people were not really doing lockdown in Kyrgyzstan like we were in the West, like they weren't in Armenia and lots of other places. And we have this sort of like birthday celebration at a dacha, and have this incredible plov, which is the sort of fabled layered rice dish of Central Asia. And it was with duck, which is quite unusual. So there's a recipe for duck and barberry plov at the end of the Bishkek chapter. Partly because duck and barberries are obviously quite tart. That's a really nice flavour combination. And because it was an unusual plov to me. So, that's a look at that.
It's interesting because I think that what a lot of tourists do, you scour the surface of a place, whereas the food that you describe takes you in. It literally opens the door. You share it with new friends. It's about going deeper. Is that for you what food represents in the telling of these stories? Is it about the depth and the sharing and the real feeling of being there?
Yes, I think it is that. But I think with the countries that I write about, some of them are more accessible to people, I think, than others. So if you're writing about Georgia or Turkey, fine. But if you start trying to explain to people about how a country like, say, Tajikistan operates in the modern world, like what the landscape's like, what the orchards are like, what the politics is like, trying to give somebody a kind of overview and to hook them in and make them interested, food is a really good way of doing that. So it's like, it's a sort of gentle way in, and then once you've got people, you sort of lure them in with the food, then you can start telling them a little bit about modern history, or how the city works, or every other aspect of, say, Tajik life. But food is a very nice way of bringing people in and introducing readers to things that perhaps they might not have been interested in otherwise, if you see what I mean.
I mean, ingredients, you use the pantry and the ingredients as postcards, don't you? It's very, you're painting pictures.
Yeah, I always say that recipes to me are like postcards. So they're like, there was this great writer, Leslie Blanche, who some of your listeners will definitely know of, who was kind of very grand and very eccentric. But she wrote very interestingly about food and also loved Central Asia. And she would sort of talk about this. But for her, the recipes, I think she sort of saw them as trophies. So she would sort of, they were more like, this sounds a bit harsh, maybe a bit more like stealing. And I try and be a bit more gentle than that. I try and see them more as, present them more as postcards, as a way of sending them to other people, So I'm like the mailman. I'm the in-betweener who brings it back and then shares it with someone else. I don't want to claim it in any way. Obviously, it's not mine. But I think writing about other people, it's a very sensitive thing, and it has to be done. You were talking about empathy earlier. It has to be done with empathy. It has to be done with engagement and respect. But it doesn't have to always be an exercise of power or theft of identity. It can be if it's done in the correct way, and I do try my best, and I'm sure I don't get it right all the time, but I try and make sure that I'm being sensitive as much as possible.
Thanks for listening. Head over to my Substack for extra bites from Caroline Eden, including one of the recipes and something really special that she captured on her travels in Kyrgyzstan. And I'll see you next week.